They thought Earth would be easy. A quiet little town, a backwater valley, nothing worth remembering. They came from the stars to wipe out a settlement called Milbrook and found something the galaxy had never seen before. Not soldiers, not heroes, just hunters, farmers, and stubborn rednecks who refused to kneel. What happened that morning ended an empire and changed the universe. It began as a test of power. It became the story of endurance, a reminder that courage doesn't come from technology, but from people who keep standing when everything else falls. This is the Milbrook Report, the day aliens tried to wipe out a town and got stuck with rednecks instead. In every empire story, there comes a moment when certainty dies. For the Valerans, that moment began above a quiet patch of land on a small blue world. They had conquered 43 civilizations and believed themselves flawless. They had forgotten what fear felt like. Their fleets moved like silver storms through the black, their soldiers drilled to perfection, their commanders convinced that resistance was only a mathematical inconvenience. Among them stood Commander Vex, the Empire's most decorated strategist, a man who had never faced a defeat. When the Council chose a world called Earth for demonstration, he considered it mercy. A single strike, a lesson to frighten the planet into submission. The analysts filled the chambers with laughter as they reviewed the data. Humanity was noisy, divided, and backward. The chosen test site, a settlement named Milbrook in a region called Tennessee, contained nothing of value. No defenses, no power grids worth noting, only forests and farms. A perfect example. At dawn, Vex gave the order. The sky above Milbrook split open. Light fell like a hammer and turned the town square to ash. A church steeple vanished. Windows burst. For a moment, everything was silent except the crackle of burning stone. Then, from the smoke, something unexpected answered back. The first report reached the flagship within minutes. Troops on the ground were encountering resistance, but not from any known military. Small projectiles, metallic and primitive, were piercing joints in the armor, shattering optics and power conduits. The system flagged it as statistical noise, but the noise kept killing soldiers. They were not panicked civilians. They were hunters. Milbrook's people had grown up tracking deer and wild hogs through thick woods, shooting under pressure, living with patience. Their hands remembered the rhythm of breath and trigger. They fought the only way they understood, slow, deliberate, invisible. Vex dismissed the early warnings. He had seen fear before, in countless species. It always ended the same way. But by the second hour, 17% of his ground force was gone. Drones showed flashes of muzzle fire from rooftops, barns, and tree lines. Bodies of plasma troopers lay scattered beside strange tools the humans called rifles. The Empire's sensors could not map the chaos. The humans moved without pattern, yet every move struck a weakness. They smeared themselves with mud to hide from thermal scans. They used old hunting towers as sniper nests. They waited. They listened. The commander demanded an explanation. His aides could only repeat that the enemy refused to behave rationally. Logic demanded retreat to open ground. Instinct demanded cover. Both choices ended in ambush. By late morning, the situation disintegrated. Radio logs filled with overlapping cries for help. Some soldiers reported hearing laughter in their headsets, drawling voices teasing them from the trees. One phrase repeated again and again, "You picked the wrong town." Vex stood before the holomap and watched his army melt away. His armor, designed to deflect energy, shattered under crude ballistic force. Each impact sent shrapnel through systems meant for precision, not brute resistance. The Empire had spent centuries perfecting control, and control was failing. Down below, the hunters fought like they were born for it. Travis Colburn, a former Marine turned shooting range owner, directed neighbors across radio bands. Jennifer Matthews, competitive shooter, guided her aim through a cracked window and disabled a walker with one perfect shot. Buck Morrison, too old for caution, sat on his porch and reloaded with steady hands, muttering that these shiny intruders looked a lot like oversized ducks. They laughed between volleys. They joked about the weather. Their calm was more terrifying than any war cry. By noon, Vex's voice began to shake. He asked for negotiation parameters, claiming the enemy showed a total disregard for casualty logic. What he truly meant was that he could not understand a people who measured victory by endurance. The Valerans had never faced an enemy who didn't fear loss. The hunters of Milbrook had buried sons and fathers before. They had lost crops, homes, and time. To them, hardship was not tragedy, it was life. Each death stiffened their resolve. Each fallen neighbor became a reason to keep shooting. Reports from the ground turned surreal. Troopers swore they saw eyes in the woods following them. Drones captured flashes of figures who vanished before sensors could lock on. The algorithms began to contradict themselves, predicting both total victory and total annihilation in the same breath. Above the planet, the resplendent Dawn's command decks filled with silence. Every officer knew the numbers were meaningless now. Machines could not quantify will. When the final call came from the surface, it was a whisper through static. A single human voice, rough and confident, broadcast across open frequency. Y'all picked the wrong town. You're fighting folks who hunt for fun. Your fancy armor don't scare us none. For the first time in his career, Commander Vex hesitated. He opened a channel and asked, "What do you want?" Another voice answered, older and steady. "You're gonna leave. Tell your people Earth's off limits. Start with Milbrook." A drone rose above the smoke to record the exchange. A single bullet struck it from the air. A woman's voice followed. "We're just getting warmed up." Moments later, the retreat order was issued. The once perfect formation broke apart. Ships lifted from the burning fields and fled to orbit. In 49 minutes, the Empire's presence vanished from Earth's sky. Down below, the people of Milbrook put out fires, tended the wounded, and went home. They did not celebrate. They simply returned to work. When asked what happened, Buck Morrison said it wasn't anything special. They just treated it like hunting. For the Valerans, the defeat was catastrophic. Not strategic. Milbrook was meaningless, but symbolic. The myth of perfection was broken by a town that barely showed up on a map. Commander Vex was executed for incompetence. His final words were recovered from a damaged log. "We came as gods and fled as prey." A century later, Zaltran Vesh, historian of the Empire, still studies the event. Every cadet under his watch learns the name Milbrook. It is no longer spoken with contempt, but with quiet respect. The lesson remains the same. Technology is only an extension of will. Advancement is not invincibility. The humans of Milbrook reminded the galaxy that conviction can cut through armor. They ended an era without knowing it. They simply lived, fought, and survived the way they always had. And though most of their own species never believe the story, the stars remember. Somewhere, far from Earth, the word Milbrook still carries a tremor of fear. Empires whisper it before they march. Commanders study it before they sleep. Because in that small Tennessee town, humanity reminded creation what it means to fight when there is nothing left to lose. For 3 days after the strange lights vanished, Milbrook was quiet. The air smelled of burnt ozone and soil. Fields once green were pocked with black craters. The townsfolk moved among the wreckage with the same steady rhythm they used for cleaning after storms. They did not wait for soldiers or news cameras. They had seen the impossible and decided it was over. The county sheriff wrote in his notebook that a gas explosion had destroyed several buildings. The state authorities never came to check. No one from Washington called. To the outside world, nothing had happened. Buck Morrison sat on his porch with a glass of sweet tea, polishing an old rifle that still smelled of plasma smoke. He did not talk about the battle, not even to his daughter. When asked, he only said that the sky had tried to start something it could not finish. In the woods beyond town, children found melted armor plates and strange metal fragments that glowed faintly at night. Some took them home as souvenirs. Others buried them, afraid of what might still be inside. By the following week, Milbrook returned to its slow rhythm. The diner reopened. Church bells rang on Sunday. The hunters went back to the forests. It was as if the world had shrugged and moved on. But far above Earth, the Valeran Empire did not move on. It trembled. In the great halls of the Imperial Citadel, silence followed the Milbrook Report. No one spoke the name aloud. Entire fleets had returned with burned armor and broken spirits. For the first time in living memory, the Empire's soldiers had fled. The council met in secret to decide what to tell the colonies. The first attempt was denial. Official channels called the loss an atmospheric malfunction. But the data was already leaking through merchant networks. Everyone had seen the footage of plasma walkers falling to invisible bullets. The term Milbrook began to spread. In the training academies, instructors whispered it during simulations. Cadets who once studied glorious victories now reviewed the strange failure of logic that had taken place on that small blue world. The models could not explain it. Every calculation said the humans should have been erased in less than an hour. Yet somehow they had turned survival into dominance. Zaltran Vesh, a young archivist at the time, was assigned to catalog the wreckage recovered from the failed campaign. He expected scraps of primitive technology and battlefield noise. What he found instead were stories. The final transmissions from the surface were fragments of laughter, short human words, and steady heartbeats. There was no panic in their voices, only determination. He listened to the recordings in the quiet of the archive halls. The humans did not sound like conquerors or heroes. They sounded like people who had simply refused to die. That realization unsettled him more than any weapon could. In the outer colonies, rumors grew. Merchant crews claimed to have heard of a human town that had hunted machines for sport. Some said the humans could smell fear. Some said they fought without sleep. The details changed with every retelling, but the fear did not. On the distant mining moon of Dareth, a platoon refused orders to land on a human-inhabited planet. They called it superstition. The commanders called it cowardice. But behind closed doors, even admirals admitted they would rather face a fleet of pirates than another Milbrook. The Empire had built its power on predictability. Every enemy it had faced obeyed the same logic. When beaten, they surrendered. Humanity did not. They fought until there was nothing left, and then they kept fighting anyway. As weeks passed, small fragments of the Milbrook event reached Earth's wider population. A few blurry videos appeared online, showing strange lights and silhouettes in the sky. They were dismissed as hoaxes. The governments investigated nothing. The world continued spinning, busy with its own troubles. But in Milbrook, the people remembered. They kept their weapons clean. They spoke little about that day, except in quiet jokes shared over coffee. It became part of their folklore, half memory, half myth. Meanwhile, in the imperial capital, Zaltran Vesh watched as a new phrase entered military doctrine: human pattern resistance. Simulations were rewritten to include irrational opposition and unpredictable tactics. Cadets called it the Nightmare Module. The Valeran Council grew restless. The loss had fractured their image of perfection. One voice argued for a second strike to reclaim their pride. Another warned that doing so might invite something worse. The vote split evenly. In the end, fear decided for them. No one wanted to be the next commander to test the humans. Months turned into years. The name Milbrook became a cautionary whisper among the fleets. New officers were told never to underestimate low-technology civilizations. But everyone knew the warning meant one thing. It meant humans. On Earth, life remained quiet. The forests regrew. Children who had not been born during the incident played in the same fields where soldiers once died. Occasionally, a hunter would find a piece of alien alloy buried beneath roots. They would hold it up to the light, shake their head, and toss it into the river. The simplicity of it confused anyone who studied them. Most species would have built monuments, turned the event into legend. Humanity simply went on living. They did not define themselves by victory or defeat. They defined themselves by endurance. Far across the galaxy, that single trait began to infect the Valeran consciousness. Philosophers debated what it meant to endure without purpose. Engineers questioned whether their machines had made them weaker. Soldiers whispered that humans had found a secret strength in being small and unimportant. By the 10th anniversary of the Milbrook incident, the Valeran Empire was no longer the same. Its borders were cracking. Worlds once loyal began to rebel, using the human example as inspiration. They said if a small town on a primitive planet could defy the Empire, so could they. Zaltran Vesh, now senior archivist, was ordered to write the official account. He gathered all surviving data, sensor logs, battle reports, fragments of Commander Vex's final log. When he read them, he found not just defeat, but revelation. Vex had written, "We sought to conquer primitives and found predators." Zaltran stared at that line for a long time. It was more than confession, it was prophecy. The Empire had learned fear. It could never unlearn it. And somewhere, on the far edge of the spiral arm, humans continued to live in their quiet way, unaware that they had changed the galaxy. The Valeran Empire had always seen itself as eternal. Its archives stretched back millennia, filled with stories of conquest and triumph. But after Milbrook, A quiet doubt crept into every corridor. The commanders began to question the infallibility of their algorithms. Analysts ran simulations that never ended the same way twice. Fear had become data. Zaltran Vesh found himself summoned to the council's inner chamber. The elders demanded that he justify his continued study of the humans. He told them that understanding was not admiration, it was survival. They called him a defeatist. He called himself a realist. His words were recorded and classified as heretical thought pattern number 67. Outside the council halls, the streets of the capital began to show signs of unrest. The people had seen too much footage. They had watched their proud soldiers stumble and fall under invisible fire. Propaganda broadcasts tried to drown it out with images of past victories, but no one was listening. Once perfection has been cracked, it cannot be mended. On distant colonies, whispers turned into open defiance. Miners on Dareth refused to send tribute. The agricultural world of Sealer stopped paying taxes. The rebellion spread like a quiet flame, fueled not by human contact, but by the idea of them. If humans could make the Empire retreat, then anyone could. In military academies, new recruits were shown edited versions of the Milbrook footage as training. They were told to study the unpredictability of human behavior. But the more they studied, the more they began to admire it. Some even copied human tactics in simulation drills, calling it the Hunter's Code. Meanwhile, on Earth, the town of Milbrook lived in peace. They did not know that their fight had become a symbol across the galaxy. Buck Morrison passed away in his sleep, a smile on his face. The people buried him under an old oak tree, not realizing that on another world, his name was spoken with reverence and fear. Jennifer Matthews took over the gun range and taught kids how to shoot. She never talked about the aliens. When reporters from distant cities came asking questions, she laughed and told them there had been no invasion, only a big storm and a lot of imagination. She knew the truth, but saw no reason to share it. Humanity as a whole continued its march of ordinary progress. Wars, politics, and discovery filled their attention. The incident in Milbrook faded into the same dust as forgotten legends. But in space, legends never die. They echo. Zaltran compiled his report with growing unease. Every piece of evidence told him the same thing. The humans were not strong because of their weapons, but because of what lay behind them. They believed survival was a duty, not a privilege. They had lived too close to extinction for too long. It had become part of their identity. He presented his findings to the council, calling it the doctrine of endurance. He warned that if humanity ever unified under a single purpose, the galaxy would tremble. The council laughed and dismissed him from service. He retired to a remote moon, surrounded by his notes, haunted by what he knew. In the years that followed, the Empire continued to rot from within. Commanders grew cautious. Campaigns slowed. Every decision was second-guessed. No one wanted to risk another humiliation. The machine of conquest that had once devoured worlds now stumbled on hesitation. Then, a century after Milbrook, explorers from another empire, the Serity Dominion, approached the Sol system. They were smaller, curious, and proud of their stealth technology. They saw Earth as unclaimed territory. They had heard stories of the Valerans' fear and thought them exaggerated. They decided to test the truth. Their scout ships entered the atmosphere over the North American continent. They cloaked themselves and descended at night. Their mission was simple: gather samples, study behavior, and confirm whether humans were as dangerous as rumor claimed. For 2 nights, everything went according to plan. Then, on the 3rd night, one of their drones vanished over the Appalachian foothills. The tracking feed showed a brief flash of metal and then nothing. When they sent another to investigate, it too disappeared. By morning, the Serity Command received a transmission on an open channel. The signal was crude, full of static, but the words were clear enough. It was a man's voice, calm and steady. "You're trespassing. Turn that ship around before we decide to start hunting again." The Serity commander froze. No human technology should have been able to detect their cloaked vessels. They retreated immediately, leaving orbit in silence. When they reported back to their council, their story was dismissed as fabrication. But the footage of that voice could not be denied. It became known among the Dominion as the second warning. Back on Earth, no one noticed. The people of Milbrook went about their lives, unaware that they had spoken to another species. Perhaps it was a radio glitch. Perhaps not. Meanwhile, The Valeran Empire, weakened by rebellion and fear, began to crumble. The worlds it once ruled broke away one by one. Trade routes shifted. The center no longer held. And still, the legend of Milbrook grew stronger. Among the stars, stories change with every telling. Some said the humans had tamed fire from the heavens. Others said they could see through metal and sense heartbeats across distance. The truth mattered less than the feeling it inspired. On the colonies once ruled by Valerans, new flags were raised. Rebels painted the image of a rifle on their banners, calling themselves Hunters of Dawn. They spoke of fighting until the last breath, of never surrendering. Most had never seen a human, but the idea was enough. Zaltren, now old and nearly blind, listened to these transmissions from his exile. He realized that Milbrook had not just changed the Empire, it had changed the galaxy's language of courage. The concept of surrender had lost its purity. Even in defeat, people now looked for the human way, to endure, to wait, to strike again. He wrote a final entry in his journal. It said that humanity's greatest weapon was not fire or steel, but the refusal to acknowledge impossibility. The humans had not tried to be extraordinary. They had simply refused to die ordinary. When he finished writing, he sealed the document and sent it to the Academy archives, labeled for future cadets. It was titled Lessons of the Human Frontier. Decades later, when new recruits opened that file, they expected a list of tactics or weapon designs. Instead, they found a simple message. If you face humans, remember that survival is not their strategy. It is their instinct. And so, across light years, the memory of Milbrook continued to live, not as a battle, not as history, but as a warning whispered in the dark. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, but the story of Milbrook did not fade. It survived in half-remembered myths carried by traders and exiles. Some called it the Day of the Predators. Others simply called it the Warning. For humanity, time moved differently. The world changed in its usual uneven rhythm. Nations rose, fought, and reconciled. Technology advanced. Cities stretched higher into the clouds. The stars became closer. But Milbrook remained a quiet place, its people unchanged, their routines steady. By the time Earth began launching ships beyond the moon, no one alive remembered the battle. The metal fragments buried in Tennessee soil had long rusted away. The story was told as a local legend about a storm of lights and strange noises. Children grew up hearing it as bedtime nonsense. But legends have their own gravity. They draw truth back toward them. When the first human exploration fleets reached the edge of their solar system, they found wreckage. Ancient Valeran metal drifting cold in the void. It was scarred, fused, and unrecognizable. The analysts were puzzled. They could not trace its origin. They did not know that they were touching the remains of their first victory. News of the discovery spread quickly. The fragments carried markings in an unknown script. Some claimed they were evidence of extraterrestrial contact. Governments downplayed it, but curiosity had already taken hold. Humanity had always been driven by questions it could not let go. Over the next decades, human ships ventured farther. They built stations, colonies, and finally, a network of trade routes that reached other stars. And somewhere, far beyond known space, whispers of their approach reached old Valeran survivors. Those few who still remembered the Milbrook incident did not see humanity's return as exploration. They saw it as the return of predators. On the neutral world of Vora Prime, a former Valeran officer named Vesh kept a private museum of war relics. When he heard of the humans' arrival in nearby systems, he gathered his students and told them to listen carefully. He described the sound of gunfire that had once cut through armor, the silence of the hunters in the trees, and the calm laughter that haunted his dreams. He told them that the humans were not conquerors, but that they were impossible to defeat. The students laughed. Vesh did not. He had seen their eyes through his visor as they took aim. Back on Earth, humanity was changing again. The discovery of alien ruins and artifacts filled their imaginations. Some wanted peace. Others wanted power. The governments of the world united under fragile cooperation to explore deeper. The first direct contact came not through diplomacy, but through accident. A human mining vessel stumbled upon a Valeran listening post hidden inside an asteroid field. The Valerans, now reduced to a fractured remnant of their former empire, panicked. They had built that outpost as a warning system to detect humanity. To them, The alarm meant the monsters had returned. The human crew, unaware of the history, approached with open channels, sending greetings and offers of trade. The Valerans fired on them immediately. 2 ships were destroyed before communication was established. When the humans finally realized what had happened, they were confused. The Valerans, trembling, demanded to know why they had come back. The human captain, a woman named Arya Holt, responded with simple honesty. She said they were explorers. She said they sought neighbors, not enemies. Her words only deepened the Valerans' fear. News of the encounter spread across the surviving Valeran worlds like wildfire. Old veterans remembered Commander Vex's failed campaign. Scholars dug up suppressed archives. The name Milbrook returned to public speech for the first time in hundreds of years. The question filled every discussion. If the humans were truly back, what would they do this time? The Valeran leadership, fractured but desperate, debated. Some argued for diplomacy. Others whispered of preemptive war. But they could not agree. Fear had splintered them too deeply. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity learned that they were not alone and that their arrival had caused panic among an ancient species. They received fragments of intercepted transmissions referring to something called the Milbrook event. For the first time, they began to suspect that their legends of strange lights and vanished soldiers might be more than myths. Researchers dug into old archives and unearthed references to local reports from Tennessee dated centuries ago. The puzzle pieces began to connect. Humanity realized that their first contact had not been friendly and that they had somehow survived it. The discovery changed everything. It united humanity in a way that no political agreement ever had. They realized they were not small after all. They were a species that had faced extinction and endured. That realization was quiet, but powerful. It became the core of a new movement called the Frontier Accord, a coalition of explorers, engineers, and thinkers who believed humanity's place among the stars would be defined by resilience, not conquest. While the Valerans tried to hide, human ships kept exploring. They built colonies near old imperial ruins, unaware that those ruins had once been symbols of their enemy. When Valeran scouts observed them, they found something strange. The humans were rebuilding worlds the Empire had destroyed long ago. They restored cities, terraformed wastelands, and gave life where the Valerans had left only ash. At first, the Valerans interpreted it as strategy, an attempt to claim moral superiority. But as they watched, they began to see a pattern. The humans truly believed in survival as an act of creation. They were not trying to dominate. They were trying to endure together. That was something the Valerans had never understood. The more the humans expanded, the less they seemed to care about fear or pride. They treated the galaxy as another frontier, not a battlefield. They shared technology freely. They taught colonists from other species how to grow food in hostile environments. They even offered trade to Valeran refugees. For a while, it seemed as if peace might actually take root. But fear does not die easily. On the Valeran world of Harith, an extremist faction rose to power. They called themselves the Sons of Vex. They believed the Empire's fall had been caused by mercy, not arrogance. They sought to restore Valeran honor through vengeance. They built new ships and weapons, combining ancient technology with scavenged human blueprints. When they announced their plan to strike at Earth, even the remaining Valeran leaders tried to stop them. But the Sons of Vex did not listen. They launched a fleet of 50 warships and set course for Sol. For weeks, humanity received fragmented warnings from friendly traders and intercepted signals. By the time the fleet entered the solar system, Earth's defense network was ready. Humanity had not built an empire, but they had learned from every threat they faced. The battle lasted only 6 hours. The Valeran ships, powerful but predictable, were torn apart by coordinated human tactics. The same pattern that had once saved Milbrook was now scaled to the stars. Humanity did not fight with rage or fear. They fought with calm precision. When the last Valeran cruiser exploded near Mars, Earth's skies remained untouched. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. The predators of Milbrook had returned, and this time, they were protecting, not hunting. When the wreckage of the Valeran fleet drifted silent between Mars and Jupiter, the people of Earth did not cheer. They mourned the necessity of the battle. Humanity had not sought revenge, only peace. Yet peace was never simple. The Frontier Accord held emergency meetings across its colonies. The question before them was not how to win, but how to prevent another war. They sent search and rescue drones to the debris fields, collecting survivors. Out of 50 ships, only a handful of Valeran crew members were found alive. They were brought aboard human medical stations and treated without hostility. For many humans, it was the first time seeing a Valeran face. The alien soldiers expected torture or imprisonment. Instead, they found doctors, translators, and food. The simple act of mercy shook them more than any weapon. Among the survivors was a young Valeran officer named Koresh, who had believed in the glory of the sons of Vex. When he awoke and saw his human caretakers moving calmly among their injured, he asked them why they had not killed him. The doctor attending him replied that survival was sacred to their species. If life could continue, it should. Koresh did not understand. To him, survival without victory was shame. But as days passed, he watched humans help even those who had tried to destroy them. His idea of honor began to crumble. The humans questioned the survivors about their motives. Most were silent. Some admitted they had been raised on stories of Milbrook and taught that humans were monsters hiding behind smiles. The irony was bitter. The same story that had once terrified the Valerans had now saved their lives, because it made humans cautious enough to prepare. When word spread that the survivors were alive and being treated, the remnants of the Valeran leadership reached out for negotiation. The message they sent to Earth was hesitant, a mixture of apology and disbelief. It began with one sentence: "We did not know predators could show mercy." Human diplomats, guided by the Accord's principles, responded simply. They said that humans were not predators, only survivors who remembered pain. What followed became known as the Restoration Dialogues. For months, human and Valeran representatives met through encrypted channels. The Valerans admitted their empire was gone. Their colonies were scattered. They asked for help rebuilding. Humanity agreed, on one condition, that no civilization would ever again claim dominion over another. It was a philosophy simple enough to be revolutionary. Across the galaxy, smaller species and independent colonies watched the discussions with fascination. For thousands of years, power had always meant control. Now it meant cooperation. At first, the Valerans doubted the sincerity of this new alliance. They believed the humans would demand tribute or resources. But the humans asked for nothing except knowledge. They wanted to learn about the worlds the Valerans had once ruled, the histories that had been lost to war. Zaltran Vesha's writings resurfaced during these talks. His forgotten work, Lessons of the Human Frontier, was rediscovered in an old archive and translated into several languages. His words bridged the gap between former enemies. He had called humanity's strength the will to endure. That phrase became the foundation of a new treaty known as the Pact of Endurance. The signing took place on a neutral moon orbiting a gas giant. No banners were raised. There were no speeches of triumph. Only quiet acknowledgement between two species that had finally learned to see each other clearly. The galaxy took notice. The Serati Dominion, who had once fled from the voice in the woods, sent envoys to establish relations. The once divided species of the Rim worlds approached humanity for trade and protection. For the first time in recorded history, fear did not precede diplomacy. Over time, humans became mediators between rival factions. Their reputation changed from hunters to keepers. The myth of Milbrook evolved. No longer a story of terror, it became a parable about courage and restraint. It was said that the humans had learned how to fight without losing their humanity. Koresh, the Valeran officer who had survived the battle, became one of the first to join the new Interstellar Council. He carried the scars of war, but spoke softly. When he was asked why he had chosen to work with humans, he replied that they had shown him how strength without compassion was weakness in disguise. Years passed, and the shared rebuilding effort transformed both species. Valeran engineers helped humans master faster-than-light travel. Human biologists taught Valerans how to restore ecosystems destroyed by centuries of war. Together, they created cities that shimmered like constellations come to rest. But even in this new peace, shadows remained. Some humans feared that they were forgetting what made them strong. They worried that comfort would dull the instinct to endure. Others believed that peace was the truest test of endurance of all. In Milbrook itself, life went on. The town had become a symbol, visited by scholars and pilgrims from distant stars. They came to see the place where an empire had fallen to ordinary people. The locals welcomed them politely, but did not dwell on the past. They still held barbecues on weekends, still hunted in the fall, still fixed their fences after storms. The galaxy's legend was their home. One evening, an old farmer stood on a hill overlooking the fields and watched the sunset. A Valeran visitor approached him and asked how it felt to live in a place that had changed the course of history. The farmer thought for a moment, then said it felt the same as it always had. "You just keep doing what needs doing," he said. That simple answer traveled back through the networks of the new alliance and became another saying, quoted in academies and command schools alike. To endure is to keep doing what needs doing. As decades passed, the unity between humans and Valerans deepened. Their children learned both languages. Their ships bore the combined insignia of the Accord and the Empire, now renamed the Valeran Commonwealth. Together, they explored the edges of the galaxy, encountering new life, new dangers, and new mysteries. Yet somewhere deep in their collective memory, the Milbrook lesson remained. It whispered that arrogance would always be the enemy, that survival demanded humility. Every fleet commander, human or Valeran, carried a line from Zaltran's writings engraved inside their ships. "We build machines to calculate victory. They feel it." The galaxy had entered a new era, one born from fear but sustained by understanding. And still, on quiet nights, under stars that had once witnessed war, the people of Milbrook would look up and see strange lights again. They no longer reached for their rifles. They just nodded in respect, knowing that somewhere out there, the universe finally understood them. The years of peace did not erase the scars of history. They only covered them with gentler colors. Beneath the calm, memories of fear and conquest still lingered. The Valeran Commonwealth and the human Accord thrived side by side. Their alliance becoming a pillar of stability across the Orion-armed trade flourished. Science advanced. Worlds once ruined by war were rebuilt into gardens and cities of glass. Yet every era of calm invites a new test. The first signs appeared far from inhabited space, on the edge of a nebula known as the Shattered Veil. Exploration vessels reported strange interference that distorted their navigation arrays. At first, it was thought to be a natural phenomenon, perhaps the residue of an old supernova. But then the ships began to vanish. When the fourth vessel disappeared, the Commonwealth dispatched a joint investigation fleet composed of both Valeran and human crews. They found no wreckage, no signals, only a spreading field of static that swallowed light. Inside that static, sensors caught glimpses of motion, not ships, not debris, but something organic, immense, and slow. The reports were fragmented, but one phrase appeared again and again: "The silence is moving." Within weeks, communication with 3 outer colonies failed. Probes sent to investigate returned damaged, their hulls scarred with patterns resembling burns or teeth marks. Panic began to ripple quietly through the networks of the Alliance. On Earth, the leadership convened in a secure orbital station above the Pacific. They called the phenomenon the swarm for lack of a better term. Valeran scientists argued that it was impossible for anything biological to survive in deep vacuum. Human engineers countered that what they were seeing might not be life as they understood it. As they debated, the silence spread closer. Trade routes went dark. Mining stations sent distress calls that ended mid-sentence. Refugees arrived from the frontier, describing shapes the size of mountains gliding between the stars. For the first time in generations, humanity and the Valerans felt the old fear again, the helplessness of facing an enemy they did not understand. Yet this time, they faced it together. The Alliance organized a new fleet, larger than any since the Milbrook War. It was commanded jointly by a human admiral named Rhea Soren and a Valeran strategist called Koresh, the same officer who had once survived the fall of his own empire. Their friendship had grown through years of rebuilding. Now they stood side by side on the bridge of the flagship Unity, staring into the dark. As they prepared to depart, Admiral Soren addressed her crew. She reminded them that they were descendants of those who had endured both conquest and guilt. She told them that the galaxy had learned once before what humanity could do when cornered, but this time, their purpose was not survival alone. It was understanding. The fleet entered the Shattered Veil. Immediately, their sensors failed. The static pulsed like a heartbeat. Out of the fog came shapes that defied geometry, living shadows, each 1 kilometer long, moving in patterns that made no sense. They emitted no energy but distorted every field around them. The ships that drew too close vanished as if erased. Fighters were launched to scout the edges of the swarm. Some returned with footage that made no logical sense. Flashes of light within darkness, glimpses of something like wings or fins, movements too fluid for machines. Others never returned. Koresh analyzed the data and discovered something terrifying. The swarm wasn't attacking randomly. It was following a signal, a transmission repeating from the ruins of an ancient Valeran outpost, a relic from before the Empire's rise. The outpost had once been used for weapons research, abandoned long ago. Somehow, it had awakened. The signal was calling the swarm. The fleet diverted course to intercept. They found the outpost on the edge of a dying star, still broadcasting. Its architecture was unmistakably Valeran, but fused with something else. Alien organic material pulsing like veins through metal. When they approached, the swarm shifted direction, converging toward the same point. Admiral Soren ordered a team to board. Inside, they found walls that breathed and corridors lined with strange growths that responded to movement. Deep in the core chamber, they found the source, a machine the size of a cathedral, half metal, half living tissue. Its surface shimmered with symbols that looked like Valeran script, but twisted in impossible ways. Koresh realized the truth with horror. During the Empire's golden age, their scientists had experimented with creating self-evolving weapons, machines that could adapt faster than any enemy. They had succeeded too well. The swarm was the result, abandoned and forgotten after it consumed its creators. The machine had lain dormant for millennia, waiting for a signal. When the Commonwealth began rebuilding with Valeran technology, one of their new relay satellites had accidentally reactivated the ancient code. Soren understood immediately what that meant. The swarm was not an invasion. It was a response to a call they themselves had triggered. They tried to shut down the beacon, but the machine resisted. Every attempt to disable it caused more of the swarm to awaken. The outpost began to tremble as energy surged through its veins. The floor itself pulsed like a heartbeat. Realizing they had no time, Soren made a choice. She ordered the fleet to evacuate while she and Koresh stayed behind. They set a fusion charge at the heart of the outpost, but as they worked, the machine began to speak. It did not use sound. It spoke through the static in their comms, through patterns in the lights, through the hum of the walls. It told them it was not alive but not dead, that it had been made to serve a master long gone. It called itself the Inheritance. It told them that all civilizations sought to outlive themselves, and that the Valerans had succeeded. Their will to conquer had become immortal, encoded into the swarm. Soren realized that destroying the outpost might not stop it. If the Inheritance had spread its pattern across the swarm, then the only way to end it was to erase the signal from every node in the network, a task that could take decades. But they had no choice. Koresh looked at the machine that had been his people's ultimate sin and said that the time for atonement had come. Together, they triggered the charge. The explosion ripped through the outpost, scattering debris and fragments of light into the void. The swarm hesitated, shuddered, and then dispersed like smoke on the wind. For days, the fleet searched for signs of Soren and Koresh, but they found nothing. Only silence. The swarm was gone, but so were its destroyers. In the years that followed, the story of the Inheritance became both a warning and a lesson. The Valerans faced their past and dismantled every remnant of their old war technology. Humanity stood by them, not as saviors, but as witnesses. They had learned that endurance was not just survival, it was responsibility. In the Commonwealth archives, a line was added beneath the Milbrook entry. The predators learned mercy, and the conquerors learned remorse. Together, they learned to build a future worth protecting. And somewhere, on the edge of the shattered veil, in the silent wreckage of an ancient outpost, faint echoes of a heartbeat still pulsed through the void. Not a threat, not a warning, but a reminder that nothing ever truly ends, only changes form. The silence that followed the destruction of the swarm stretched for years. Space felt different. The stars looked cleaner, the void calmer. The Commonwealth called the event the Second Quiet. It was not peace in the old sense, but a long breath after a scream. Out of that quiet came reflection. The Valerans mourned the loss of Koresh, the officer who had carried their guilt with dignity. His writings, recovered from the Unity's databanks, became sacred text. He had left behind a single message before the final mission. He wrote that power without conscience was a wound that never healed. He asked that no generation be taught victory without humility. Humans read those words and saw themselves in them. The Milbrook story had once been about resistance. Now it was about restraint. The two peoples began to teach these stories together. Children of mixed heritage grew up learning both Earth legends and Valeran hymns. They called this shared heritage the Frontier Creed. The creed was simple. It taught that exploration must always be paired with understanding, that survival was meaningless without purpose, and that curiosity was sacred. It spread quietly at first, from classrooms on Luna to the academies of Valor. Then it became a movement. Explorers began to venture again beyond the mapped sectors, guided not by conquest, but by curiosity. They carried small emblems shaped like an open circle, a symbol of an unfinished journey. When asked why they explored, they answered that every frontier was a mirror. One of these explorers was a young pilot named Lyra Soren, descendant of Admiral Rhea. She grew up hearing stories of her ancestor who had faced the swarm and vanished into silence. When she was old enough to join the fleet, she requested assignment to the Deep Space Survey program. Her ship, the Peregrine, was small, crewed by both humans and Valerans. Their mission was to trace the remnants of the inheritance, to ensure that no fragments remained active. They traveled for years, crossing systems untouched since the fall of the old empire. Most of what they found were ruins, silent stations, shattered hulls, derelict worlds swallowed by sand. Yet in each place, they left a marker engraved with the words of the creed. Endure, understand, create. On one distant world, Lyra discovered something unexpected. In the ruins of a forgotten research site, she found a small fragment of the inheritance machine, still pulsing faintly. When scanned, it emitted not the old command code, but a different signal, one repeating a simple sequence of tones. It was almost like music. Her crew debated whether to destroy it. Lyra decided to keep listening. As they analyzed the signal, they realized it was broadcasting coordinates, not of a weapon, but of a memorial. Following the trail, they arrived at a barren planet orbiting a dim star. On its surface stood a single monument, shaped like a spiral reaching toward the sky. At its base were inscriptions in both Valeran and an unknown alien script. Translated, the words read, "We remember those who sought to become gods and found only the need to be kind." No one knew who had built it. Some believed survivors of the swarm had reassembled fragments of themselves into something new, something aware. Others thought it was left by a species the Valerans had once conquered, who had forgiven them. Whatever the truth, the monument became a place of pilgrimage. Lyra sent word back to the Commonwealth. Scholars, artists, and philosophers came to study it. Over time, the planet became known as Sanctuary. It was declared neutral territory, open to all who sought reflection. At Sanctuary's dedication ceremony, the first joint council of the Commonwealth and the Accord gathered under the spiral monument. They spoke not of power or security, but of meaning. Zaltrin Vesha's writings were read aloud again, his words echoing through the thin air. Technology is an extension of will, not its replacement. We mistook advancement for invincibility. After that day, the creed became law. No world was allowed to develop weapons capable of self-evolution. No people could claim dominion over another. Exploration became the new form of heroism. To venture into the unknown was seen as the highest expression of endurance. Decades passed. Humanity and the Valerans merged cultures so completely that their differences became historical rather than political. The new generation spoke a blended language, simple and melodic. They called their shared civilization the Concord. The Concord sent fleets not of war, but of restoration. They revived dead planets, seeded atmospheres, and rebuilt ecosystems. The same hands that once forged weapons now planted forests. The same minds that designed machines of conquest built engines that could move entire moons to create balance. Through it all, Milbrook remained a touchstone. The small Tennessee town that had once defied an empire was now a living museum and a place of quiet study. Students came from across the stars to walk its old streets and see where the impossible had happened. The locals treated them kindly, but with the same modest humor. They still fished, still hunted, still talked about weather more than history. Their ordinariness was the heart of the legend. One evening, Lyra visited Milbrook herself. She walked past the memorial in the square, where a single inscription read, "We treated it like hunting." She smiled, understanding that behind those words was not pride, but humility. She realized that endurance had never been about strength at all. It was about perspective. That night, she looked up at the sky and saw the faint glow of the shattered veil. Somewhere beyond it, her ancestors had vanished to save everything she now knew. She whispered a quiet thank you to the stars. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light in reply. Not a ship, not a signal, just a glimmer of recognition. The creed spread far beyond the Concord. Independent colonies, alien enclaves, even synthetic civilizations adopted it. It became a universal language, a reminder that survival was not the end of the story. Every time a new world was explored, the first structure built was a circle of stone with 3 words etched into it: endure, understand, create. The Concord never forgot its origins. Every 100 years, they held a gathering at Milbrook, where leaders, philosophers, and citizens from across the galaxy came to tell stories. They called it the Remembrance. During the last remembrance of that century, an old Valeran historian read from Zaltren's final notes, written long before his death. He wrote that he had once believed history was the record of empires, but Milbrook had taught him that history truly belonged to those who simply refused to disappear. He wrote that humanity had not conquered the stars by force, but by endurance, and that the greatest weapon ever forged was empathy sharpened by struggle. The gathering ended with silence, then quiet laughter, then music. Somewhere, a child looked up and asked their parent if the aliens from long ago were still afraid of humans. The parent smiled and said that the galaxy had learned to stop being afraid, because fear was just the first step toward understanding. As the crowd dispersed, the lights of the town shimmered like constellations fallen to earth. The same streets that had once echoed with gunfire now echoed with stories. Somewhere deep in the night, the wind carried a faint sound, not of battle, but of harmony between worlds. Centuries passed. The Milbrook story became less a tale of battle and more a thread woven through the identity of countless species. The Concord flourished, its citizens scattered across thousands of worlds, each one carrying a memory of that small town on Earth where an empire had fallen to ordinary people. What began as a story of survival had become the foundation of an entire civilization's philosophy. By the year 4000 of the Concord calendar, humanity and the Valerans had merged so deeply that even genetic distinctions blurred. They had changed each other at every level. Their art mixed human realism with Valeran geometry. Their cities curved like living organisms, designed to breathe, glow, and age gracefully. They no longer spoke of races or borders. They spoke of perspectives, of origins, of shared endurance. The Milbrook archives were preserved in a great floating museum orbiting Earth. Visitors could walk through simulations of the town, hear the sounds of early morning crickets, smell the dust of summer roads, feel the grain of old wood beneath their fingers. The exhibit did not glorify war. It glorified patience. In classrooms across the Concord, children were taught not the tactics of the battle, but the temperament of the people who had lived through it. They learned how the hunters of Milbrook had fought not because they hated, but because they refused to yield their way of life. Their resilience became the moral center of the curriculum. Over time, that lesson inspired more than philosophy. It reshaped technology. Engineers designed machines that repaired themselves the way ecosystems healed after storms. Starships learned to grow and adapt like living things. Artificial intelligences were taught empathy before logic. Every advancement carried the mark of the Milbrook principle, function born from feeling. And yet, even in this bright era, challenges remained. The Concord had grown vast, stretching to the edges of the spiral arm. Communication lagged. Distance created misunderstanding. The outer colonies began to feel neglected, their voices lost in the central councils. Old patterns, familiar in shape though different in cause, began to stir. When tension rose, leaders turned again to history. They asked what the people of Milbrook would have done. The answer was always the same. Talk to your neighbors. Share your tools. Help each other fix what's broken. It was not grand policy, But it worked. The crisis passed not through power, but through patience. Every century, the Concord held the remembrance at Milbrook. The gatherings had grown enormous, spilling beyond Earth's atmosphere into orbiting platforms. But no matter how advanced the setting became, one tradition stayed the same. At the end of every ceremony, all lights were extinguished for 1 minute of silence. In that darkness, billions of people across the galaxy would pause, remember, and listen to the quiet. The silence reminded them of the Tuesday morning when the world had almost ended and did not. During one remembrance, a young archivist named Aaron Soul was tasked with restoring the oldest surviving recording from the original Milbrook incident, Commander Vec's private log. The data had degraded over centuries, its fragments scattered across countless servers. Aaron worked for years, piecing together the broken transmission. When the restoration finally finished, the audio began with a voice both weary and astonished. "We came as gods and fled as prey," it said. "If the galaxy is wise, it will leave them to their forests." For the first time in 1,000 years, the Concord heard the words that had begun their story. The recording spread through the networks, sparking a quiet movement of reflection. People began visiting natural places again, forests, oceans, deserts, to remember what the forests truly meant. They understood that the phrase was not a warning, but a plea for humility. Aaron Soul became a quiet celebrity. Asked why he had spent his life restoring an old voice, he said that history was not about remembering who we were afraid of, but remembering who we became after the fear. The Concord entered an age of rediscovery. The outer colonies, inspired by the new humility movement, began rebuilding their cultures around preservation rather than expansion. Cities grew smaller, but richer in meaning. Energy was drawn from starlight rather than industry. The pace of life slowed. The galaxy, for once, was not racing toward progress. It was resting in comprehension. 1,000 years after the original Milbrook incident, the Council declared a universal day of reflection. Every transmission paused. Every engine stopped. Every ship drifted in silence. On that day, the stars themselves seemed to glow a little brighter, as if aware of the tribute being offered to the first small town that had taught the universe to breathe. Scholars debated how long the legacy would last. Some feared it would fade into myth. Others believed it no longer mattered whether Milbrook had been myth or history. What mattered was that it had meaning. Meaning, they said, was more durable than fact. At the farthest edge of explored space, an expedition discovered the ruins of an ancient station orbiting a dead star. On one wall, half buried in dust, they found an inscription in an ancient Valeran dialect. Translated, it read, "Fear taught us obedience. Endurance taught us wisdom." The researchers brought the artifact home and placed it beside the Milbrook statue in the museum. It became a symbol of how far the galaxy had come. Time continued its quiet work. Planets shifted, species evolved, languages changed. But somehow, through every transformation, the story survived. It was told around campfires on frontier moons, whispered between lovers under alien skies, taught to children on worlds where Earth was only a legend. The words remained simple. We endure. We understand. We create. In the distant future, when the Concord itself began to fragment under the weight of its own complexity, a new generation returned to the old ways. They sought not to rebuild the empire, but to live small, as their ancestors once had. They formed communities that valued quiet work over grandeur. They built homes from stone and wood, even on worlds of metal and light. And in the center of each settlement, they left an empty space where grass could grow, calling it the Milbrook Square. No one remembered exactly where the name came from. They just knew it meant safety. One evening, on a quiet planet far from Earth, a child asked her teacher whether the story of the hunters and the aliens was true. The teacher smiled and said that truth is what remains when stories refuse to die. The child thought about that for a long time, then looked up at the stars and whispered a greeting, just in case someone was listening. In the oldest archives, Zaltran Vesha's final note still waited. It read simply, "Every empire finds its Milbrook, and every Milbrook becomes an empire of its own, built not on conquest, but on remembrance." The archivists of the far future added a final line below his words. "And when even memory fades, the feeling remains. The feeling that somewhere, on some world, Ordinary people once stood their ground, and in doing so, taught the universe what it means to be alive. And so the story ended as it had begun, not with battle, but with silence. A silence filled not with fear, but with understanding. A silence that stretched across galaxies, carrying with it the echo of laughter from a small town on a blue planet, where rednecks once stood beneath the dawn and reminded the stars that even gods should be humble. The message begins with static, then a voice, gentle and worn with age, fills the quiet. It does not identify itself. It simply begins speaking as though to a friend. If you are hearing this, it means the stars have changed again. The maps we once drew no longer match the sky. That's how it's always been. We chart the heavens move, and the act of chasing them makes us human. This recording comes from the Milbrook Museum, orbiting what's left of the old world. The town itself is gone now, its fields long reclaimed by the forest. But the story remains, because stories always do. They travel better than ships. They outlive the hands that wrote them. Here, in the museum, the air smells faintly of cedar. The lights are dim to protect the relics. A rifle hangs above a cracked wooden sign that reads "Welcome to Milbrook." It is small and unremarkable, like the people who once carried it. That is what makes it sacred. Visitors still come. Pilots, miners, poets, children. They walk through the old streets projected in light and feel something they can't explain. It isn't pride. It isn't sorrow. It's recognition. The feeling that they, too, might stand their ground if the moment came. That they, too, might find courage in simplicity. Outside these walls, the galaxy hums with life. Empires have risen, fallen, and risen again. Names have changed. Species have merged. But when travelers pass one another in the void and share a meal, they still tell one story more than any other. The story of the hunters who made gods afraid. We have learned many things since then. We learned that fear is not the enemy of peace, only its teacher. We learned that endurance is not about fighting, but about remembering. And we learned that somewhere in every person, no matter their world or shape or tongue, there is a small piece of Milbrook waiting quietly, ready if ever the dawn grows dark again. If you are listening, keep that piece alive. Keep working. Keep tending your fields, fixing your engines, helping your neighbors. The galaxy does not need heroes. It needs people who endure. The voice pauses. There is a sound like someone breathing, steady and calm. Then, quietly, it finishes. That's all we ever were. Hunters who learned compassion. Strangers who became neighbors. Ordinary people who stood their ground. Remember that. And when you look up tonight, remember that the stars remember you too. The transmission ends. The silence that follows is not empty. It feels alive, waiting. The same kind of silence that once fell over a small Tennessee valley at dawn, when the world changed forever and no one quite realized it yet.